Welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is entitled Interactions Between Microbes and Humans. The first part of this chapter, we're going to be discussing your normal microbiota in a little bit more detail. And then we're going to move on from there and focus more on infectious disease. So we'll be learning about, what is it about this small minority of microorganisms that concerns us so much, the pathogens. Why are they able to cause disease when the vast majority of microorganisms on the planet are not capable of doing that? And then we'll talk about some other aspects of infectious disease, such as how infectious microbes or pathogens are transmitted from one host to another, and we'll talk about epidemiology, a little bit about that subject, healthcare acquired infections. That's a huge topic for any of you guys going into healthcare. So this chapter is a little bit more extensive than chapters 9 and 10, even though it is a single chapter. There's a lot of content in here, and then I'm also pulling a few things out of the later chapters in the book to include here for chapter 11. And then that'll wind up finishing up unit 3. Then when we move into unit 4, so in chapter 11, we're learning about how these evil pathogenic microbes attack our bodies. In chapter 12 and 13 and 14, we're going to learn about how the immune system fights back. And it's a miraculous system, does an amazing job, and we'll learn more details about how all of that works. So some interesting topics here to wrap up your Biology 220 course. All right, so this first video lecture, this is where we're going to talk about the human host, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the normal microbiota, these normal organisms that live on and inside the body. Little terminology, a microbe is not technically a disease. A disease is any kind of change in state from normal health. A microbe, of course, is an organism of some type, or a virus. So pathogenic microbes can cause infectious diseases. Not all diseases are caused by microorganisms. You could have a genetic-based disorder. You might have diabetes. Those are diseases that are not caused by infectious microbes. And obviously this is a microbiology class, so we're going to be spending our time discussing diseases that are caused by microorganisms. So those are going to be infectious diseases. So what is infection? That's the process of a microbe entering the body. That's just kind of common sense. Then it has to establish itself, so it has to stay in place, and it has to get around the immune system, our host defenses, at least those early forces. And then it's got to multiply inside the host as well. It's got to increase its number. So if a microorganism is not well adapted to our bodies, based on all that fun stuff we learned back in chapter 6 and 7, if it doesn't like human body temperature, if it doesn't like the amount of oxygen gas available in a certain part of the body, if it doesn't like the solute concentration in a particular body location, all of those things that we learned about back in those chapters will influence whether or not a particular microbe can cause an infection. If an infection means you're being damaged by the microbe. Now there's another term, colonization. Microbes can colonize the human body, and that does not necessarily refer to an infection, because normal microorganisms, or the normal microbiota, colonize the human body. So they do establish themselves, they multiply on or inside our bodies, but they're not harming the body. So that's a little bit of a different term. So we've talked about normal microbiota in this class already. Another term is normal biota. Indigenous biota, like indigenous people are the native people to a particular land area on the planet. So we can think about these microorganisms that naturally live on or inside the human body as being indigenous biota. Biota is referring to organisms. Or normal flora. I should have included that here as well. Normal flora, F-L-O-R-A, is an older term that was used as well. And then there's the human microbiome, which we'll talk a little bit about shortly as well. That's a normal term that's referring to all of these little critters that live on and inside the body. All right, so earlier in this semester we learned about how different relationships can exist between hosts and microbes. So symbiotic relationships are where the relationship is required for at least one of the members, as opposed to like synergistic relationships where one or more can benefit, but those relationships are not required. In symbiosis, you can have commensalism, if you guys remember that. One organism benefits, the other is unaffected. Now, when we're thinking about normal microbes, it's generally going to be the microbe that's benefiting, and we're unaffected by it as far as we know. So those types of organisms would be called commensals. Then you have mutualistic relationships where both organisms benefit. Then, of course, we have parasitism, where the host gets harmed. So the other organism is benefiting, but it's at the expense of the host. So when we think about pathogens, pathogens exist in a parasitic relationship with the human body. Now, as far as our normal microbiota, we've talked about this before earlier in the semester. You know, back in the day when I was going through my first microbiology class, you know, it was pretty much thought that these normal microbes were mostly commensals. They were occupying spaces, you know, on the skin or in the colon, in the mouth, and they were getting benefit from it because that's where they were getting their moisture and nutrient supply. But they weren't really doing a whole lot for us. But now we know that more of these organisms are mutualists than we ever expected. We are actually benefited from them being there, and it's becoming increasingly clear that they have to be there. You know, our bodies would not be able to operate in a healthy state if we did not have these normal microbes. So we have kind of co-evolved with them throughout time, and we're dependent on them, and they're dependent on us. And in fact, there are some people today who consider the human microbiome, these microorganisms that we're carting around, as almost like an additional body system. They're so critical, they have to be there in order for us to remain in a state of health. All right, a little bit more terminology. So your normal microbiota, so this consists of mutualistic organisms and commensal types of microbes. But we can also consider some of them to be residents and some to be transient. So resident microbiota, those are ones that you tend to acquire early in life, and you always have them. So like E. coli, Escherichia coli, in the gut would be an example of a resident member of the microbiota. It's always going to be there. Staphylococcus epidermidis is a skin microorganism. It's always there. It's not going away. But then others can be considered transient. So they may colonize your body, live there temporarily, but at some point they go away. Your immune system clears them out, or some other organism outcompetes them and takes over the space that they were occupying. Staphylococcus aureus, or S. aureus, which can be pathogenic. It causes a number of different types of infections, but it is also a member of the transient microbiota in a number of people. So it's pretty commonly found on the skin, and especially up the nose. At some point, you might have to have a nasal swab done to see if you do have Staphylococcus aureus as a member of your transient microbiota, because sometimes that can be a concern if you're getting ready to have surgery. For example, you might be at more risk for infection with Staphylococcus aureus. Great diversity, very high numbers. I think earlier in the semester we mentioned that current thinking is your microbiota outnumber the cells of your own body by some kind of ratio. Some people now are saying it's more like 3 to 1. You know, previous thinking a few years ago was more like 10 to 1. So kind of the jury's still kind of out. But their numbers are thought to outnumber the number of our own cells in our body. And that is actually a number that we still don't know for sure. It's up in the trillions somewhere. This little link here, your belly button, there's an article there. You might want to click on that in the full version of the PowerPoint and read about that. It's about the belly button microbiota. So there are people who are studying what are all these organisms that live on and inside the body. And for a long time, we were dependent on being able to grow those organisms in the laboratory, like on agar culture media of some type, if we wanted to characterize them. Today, we have these very sensitive DNA-based tests that are capable, we can use things like ribotyping, if you remember that from toward the end of chapter 8. We can use techniques like that to even detect the presence of microorganisms on and inside our bodies that we can't even cultivate in the lab because we haven't figured out what their culture requirements are. We can't reproduce that yet. So these more sophisticated DNA techniques are allowing us to identify a lot of microbial species, a lot of members of the microbiota that we didn't even know about a few years ago. So it's very, very diverse. There are also individual differences. So my microbiome is going to be different from your microbiome. And there are lots of people who are doing research into those types of differences. When do you start to acquire your normal microbiota? Most of this is going to begin during the birth process. As soon as you're coming out of the body, you're getting exposed to things. Now, when you're still in the womb, covered in amniotic fluid, the thinking has been that the amniotic fluid is sterile. You don't have a microbiota while you're in the womb. You're in a sterile environment. Now, some of those lines of thinking are beginning to change because we do have more sophisticated techniques, and so now there are microorganisms being detected in body locations where they were never detected before. So it could be that line of thinking will change, and we will find that there are at least a few microorganisms that colonize a developing fetus in the womb. But traditionally it's been thought that you are in a sterile environment when you're developing as an embryo and a fetus in your mother's womb. But as soon as you come out of the body, you get exposed to all kinds of microorganisms. So that's when you get colonized by your normal microbes. Where do they live? We'll talk more about that shortly. All over the skin and then on mucous membrane linings in the body. And not even all of those. So that's where traditionally we've known the normal microbiota to exist. Generally, these are commensals or mutualists, but if you do have, they're in this state of balance with your immune system, and we don't even fully understand that yet. Why doesn't your immune system wipe out these normal microbes? And, over many generations, our bodies, our immune systems have learned to tolerate these normal microbes. However, the immune system still has to keep them under control so they don't overpopulate and start to harm us. So anything that weakens your immunity can allow normal microbes, at least of some types, to overpopulate and cause disease. Also, if they get into parts of the body where they're not supposed to be, they can cause disease. That's a pretty common problem as well. All right, so a little bit more about colonization. When do you acquire your normal microbes? Here's a picture from your book. And if you are delivered vaginally, you are going to begin picking up lots of microorganisms as you're passing through the vaginal canal, because there are many microorganisms that live along the mucous membrane lining of the vagina. During breastfeeding, during handling by physicians and other people, as soon as you're being checked out by the physician, right after you pop out of the womb, you get exposed to microorganisms during those processes. All right, so there are some differences that occur. Let's say you're delivered by a C-section, cesarean section. So you don't pass through the vagina, so you don't pick up those organisms that live naturally along the vaginal mucosal membrane. So if you're delivered by C-section, for a while after birth, your normal microbiota will be a little bit different from those of a vaginally delivered baby. Now, does that have any kind of impact on health? That's still being researched at this time. Bottle-fed infants versus breastfed infants, their intestinal tract gets colonized by different species. So people are looking into that and whether that plays a significant role in health. One thing that has been noticed, that breastfed infants are colonized really early by bacteria in a genus called Bifidobacterium. And it's known that the members of that genus, the species in that genus, ferment milk sugars like lactose, convert those to acids. Those are fermentation products. And so what that's doing is it's lowering the pH a little bit along the intestinal lining, and that's protective. So there are a number of potentially pathogenic microorganisms that don't grow as well because the pH is a little bit lower along the intestinal lining thanks to those organisms. Now, I don't want you to think the intestinal lining is acidic like the stomach lining. I always have a number of students who seem to confuse the stomach with the intestinal tract. The stomach lining has a very low pH. You've got that hydrochloric acid that's secreted there. That's not true along the intestinal lining. The intestinal lining is much closer to normal human body pH levels. But bacteria like this can help lower that pH a little bit to control some of the nasty types of microorganisms that might grow there and cause disease. All right, continuing on. So this is an important topic. Where does the normal microbiome exist? Where do our normal microbiota live? And again, this term, the human microbiome, that's a more contemporary term. This is a subject of lots of intense research. Your textbook mentions this. And what that refers to is the sum total, all of the microorganisms that live on or inside the human body. Lots of research into that area. You know, how does my microbiome differ from yours? You know, what species are living on or inside both of our bodies? Which ones are unique to my body versus yours? Lots of research into that area. Some people think that our microbiomes are so individualized that, you know, let's say you were a criminal and you touched surfaces at a crime scene, you're going to deposit some of your normal microbiome at that location. So some people think it can almost be used like fingerprints to help identify people based on the exact profile of microbial species that you're shedding, you know, at a crime scene location. So it gets down to that level. People are looking at things like, well, how is the microbiome different in people who have type 2 diabetes versus people who do not? Even with autism, people are looking at the intestinal microbiomes of people who are autistic versus those who are non-autistic to see if maybe that could play some sort of role in autism. So there's lots of research into this area, even into things that you would not think would be connected. There is some possibility that they are. And probably some of those things will shake out as being meaningful and others will not. So it's just going to take a lot of time to do that research. But I thought this was a pretty interesting graphic that I found. This came from the National Institutes of Health. It's a graphic that they put out about the Human Microbiome Project. That's a federally funded project that's looking into the microbiome and characterizing it, figuring out what species are essential for human health, which ones maybe are not. But it's kind of interesting here. This is going to highlight some locations where you expect a lot of microorganisms. But notice in a typical person, 600 or more species in the mouth, the pharynx, and that's kind of the back of your throat area, and then in parts of the respiratory system, even in your stomach, about 25 different species. So the stomach lining is acidic, so it's not a very friendly environment to most microorganisms. So if you're going to live there, you pretty much have to be acid tolerant. The skin has about 1,000 species that have been identified. Intestinal tract, at least 500 to 1,000 species. And along the urogenital tract, you know, there are at least 60 species that have been identified. And we'll probably continue to identify more of them. What types of organisms? Most of them are bacteria, but we also do have some fungi that are part of the normal human microbiome. Some protozoans, believe it or not, single-celled eukaryotes that can be part of the normal microbiome as well. There are viruses that may be part of our microbiome. There may be some viruses that are naturally part of this profile of microorganisms that live on and inside the human body. To my knowledge, there are no helminths yet that are considered to be normal microbiota that would be harmless to humans. All right, this is a table from your textbook, and I like the way that they have phrased this. This is recently updated. Sites previously known to harbor normal microbiota. So this is where conventional thinking was. Skin and then some of your mucous membranes. So again, mucous membranes. What body systems have internal mucous membrane linings? Digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive. So a mucous membrane lining is an inside lining, and somewhere there's an exit to the outside. So these are inside linings that have some pathway to an opening. So if you think about those 4 body systems, that's going to be true. So the skin and any mucous membranes close to the outside of the body, the upper respiratory tract. Okay, so that's above your larynx, above there. That's an area that's rich in microorganisms. The gastrointestinal tract, including the mouth, pretty much from one end to another. There are at least some species. The outer part of the urethra, remember, is the tube that extends from the bladder to the outside of the body and carries urine. So right around the opening, we've known for a long time that there are organisms that can live there. Along the external genitals, along the vaginal mucous membrane lining, the external ear canal, that just makes sense. It's exposed. Anything that's exposed to the outside like that is going to have normal microorganisms. And then the eyeball, the external eye, your eyelids, and also the conjunctiva, those external parts of the eye. And now you don't have as many on the eye because you have tears that flush them off all the time. So we don't have quite as many normal microbes living on the surface of the eye as you do along the other exposed areas of the skin. Now, for a long time, these were thought to be the only places where you would normally expect to find microorganisms in a healthy individual. Now, because of this more sensitive DNA testing we have, researchers have detected that there are probably at least some normal microbes in the lower respiratory tract, including the lungs. So for a long time, that was thought not to be the case. In the bladder, and again, for a long time, that was thought not to be the case. Urine is not all that friendly to most microorganisms, so these are microbes that have to be adapted to the kind of hostile conditions of the urine, acidic pH, lots of toxic wastes present. Breast milk does contain some microorganisms, and like I was just saying, the amniotic fluid in the fetus may contain normal microbiota, and that was not the thinking just a few years ago. And then interestingly, even in the brain and in the blood, so the blood has always been thought to be a location where no, you don't have microorganisms that spend their lifetime living in your blood because your immune system will attack them and destroy them and get rid of them. And certainly not in the brain. The brain has always been thought to be a place that was kept completely free of microorganisms, but there have been some studies that now are saying, yeah, maybe there are some microorganisms that live in there. And, so we've got to, we'll be figuring out over the upcoming years whether or not that's really true. And, are they really there permanently, or are they just kind of there transiently? Are they doing anything? Are they beneficial in any way? So lots of changes in thinking are occurring with this topic. Another concept, too, is your microbiome will change over time. There's a little graphic here that talks about some of the changes that occur in your intestinal microbiota as you go from being a newborn, early childhood, adult, and then finally, when you're elderly, interestingly enough, your gut or intestinal microbial communities change quite a bit. They're pretty different from when you're a younger adult. So lots of changes here as a newborn and through early childhood as you get exposed to new things, just being out there in the world. Then when you're elderly and your immune system begins to weaken as you get older, then your immune system is no longer going to be able to keep everything in the same kind of balance that it could when you were a younger adult. So there will be some species that will grow to greater populations than they could when you were a younger adult. So there are changes throughout your lifetime. And again, we're still studying and trying to figure out the significance of those types of things. Normal microbiota and disease. Now, we've talked about this before. Microbial antagonism. Your normal microbes are believed to antagonize pathogens. So how do they do that? They're preventing establishment of infection. They're blocking attachment sites. Pathogens have to attach to surfaces in your body if they're going to stay in place and multiply and start to harm you. Some members of your normal microbes secrete substances that are lethal to other types of microbes. So they're helping to, they're almost like they're producing their own little drugs that that help control the growth of pathogenic organisms in the body. There's a lot of research into that area because some people are thinking, well, okay, so if you got these microbes that produce these substances that are toxic for other microbes, now these are going to be a little bit different from antibiotic drugs that we learned about in chapter 10. There are other things like proteins and so forth that some microbes have been discovered to produce that inhibit the growth of other microorganisms. Maybe we can harness those and start to use those as new types of drugs. There's lots of research into that area as well. And we've talked about already, normal microbes can become opportunistic pathogens. So that's where that's where organisms don't normally cause disease, but in some instances they can take advantage of an opportunity to do so. So let's say you've got some intestinal member of your normal microbiota. It's not supposed to be deeper inside the body. So if you have any kind of cut through the skin or a mucous membrane, that can allow those normal microorganisms to get into parts of the body where they don't belong, and there they can harm you and cause disease. Weakened immunity can allow normal microbes to overgrow to the point that they actually are able to start harming you. Okay, so one thing I would like you guys to do, and I'll probably post this over on the discussion board for us to talk about. Watch this video clip. There's a link for it here. So you can check this out in the full version of the PowerPoint on Blackboard. Dirt and germs, are they good for kids? So take a look at that video clip. There's a line of thinking that, all of these problems that we have today, like allergies and various autoimmune disorders and so forth, they occur more in countries like the United States, where we're kind of obsessed with hygienic practices. If you go into other parts of the world where you don't really have good hygiene, now yes, people there die and are harmed in much greater numbers from infectious pathogens, but they actually have lower numbers of things like asthma and Crohn's disease, various allergic conditions and autoimmune type diseases that are caused by overreaction or inappropriate attacks by the immune system on our own body. So there's a school of thought that because we live in this overly hygienic society, we're wiping out a lot of these kind of harmless microorganisms on and inside our body, and we really need those organisms there to train our immune systems and keep our immune system under control and prevent it from overreacting to things we get exposed to, or even turning inward and attacking some of our own tissues. So that's called the hygiene hypothesis. And so that's an interesting little video clip for you guys to take a look at. All right, so that was an overview of the normal microbiome. Now we're going to start moving into the main subject of this chapter, which is what happens with infectious disease. Why does this little minority of microorganisms that are human pathogens, what makes them special? What makes them capable of harming us and causing us problems when the vast majority of microorganisms do not? So we'll start talking about that subject in the next video clip.